course, she entered the news in a very big way in Australia when they tried to ban her from entering the country because she was going to talk about vaccines, about informed consent, about us having information, and about the necessity of having our consent do something to us. Now, this was reported in the Sydney Morning Sun on January the 7th. They had had an interview, as Dr. Tenpenny pointed out, on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's radio. And they said after that, there were calls to block her from entering Australia, to bar her from entering Australia, saying her beliefs are a threat to society. But Dr. Tenpenny responded, said, no, what I really am, and what all of us are for the most part, are pro-information, pro-education, completely for freedom of choice and informed consent. So, Dr. Tenpenny, I want to talk to you in this segment. Let's talk about the laws that are already in place. You started to talk about that before, because I said I'm concerned about what they're going to do in terms of how they're going to actually implement and take and actually use these laws that they have put into place. I think they're preparing the public mentally with this scare over measles, a minor childhood disease that was never considered to be life-threatening, as we talked about. They've already put some laws in place, and a lot of laws are being proposed all over the country. Let's talk about some of those laws that are in place and the ones that are being proposed.
The one that was put into place in 1986 was the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And it was at that point in time that the pharmaceutical industry was getting sued left and right over the problems with the pertussis vaccine. Most of the drug companies that were creating vaccines went out of business, and several that were remaining went to then President Reagan and said, you've got to do something to protect us, or because this is the cornerstone of our public health and that we have to have vaccines, and without vaccines, humanity probably won't survive. And so they passed this law in 1986. Part of that law is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is the VAERS system. That is a passive collection of people who have had side effects. And the side effects can be anything from a sore arm all the way up to a death. Anybody can report a problem, and that's why the FDA doesn't take it very seriously. They just think it's anecdotal. Anybody can report a problem. Unless they see some serious trends, they don't pay any attention to it.
And I don't think most people know that that exists. I think there's a lot of stuff that's underreported because most people don't know that they could report these symptoms there. We didn't know about it with our children.
Exactly. And they actually have said that David Satcher, who was the Surgeon General at the time, said that less than 10% of adverse events are actually reported, whether that be a vaccine or a drug, less than 10%. So we know that about 12,000 VAERS reports are filed every year. And if that's only 10%, that could mean as many as 120,000 reactions, many of them serious, or go underreported because nobody knows to report them. And with that, we've paid almost $3 billion out in vaccine injury compensation claims, even though only 25% of people actually file a claim actually get compensation, and it can take years for that to happen.
How does that work out? How does that vaccine compensation work out when we can't sue the companies? It's a vaccine court, right?
Well, it's called the Vaccine Court, which is a federal court of claims where you file a claim. And if you are only 25% of the people who file the claim get any compensation. So, and there are many people who have an injury to the vaccine that don't even qualify to file for a report or file a claim, because there is a table. It's called the Vaccine Injury Table that says these are the only types of side effects that we will allow compensation for. But what about all the other people that have serious lifelong complications that start outside the window of what the table lays out there, and they can't get any claim? They're just hazards of the system. They are just disposable people that they just sacrifice themselves for the greater good, or their children, and there's no compensation. You can't sue the doctor, the hospital, the manufacturers, the government. You are just stuck with your lifelong of bad disease and no money to help you pay to get better.
So the vaccine court is another one of these nonsense courts, like the FISA court, like the traffic court, like the tax court, where you don't have any rights, you don't have any representation, you don't have a jury. It's just a whitewash for the industry.
It's an absolute kangaroo court. In fact, the people who are the judges, so to speak, they don't even call them judges. They call them special masters, and they are appointed. They have no medical background, and so they already, for the most part, are pro-vaccine. They listen to the pro-vaccine side of the equation, and they politely listen to the other side, and then say, "No, I don't think this has anything to do with it." There are very few cases for which that vaccines have been adjudicated in the favor of the.
We got to go to a break, Dr. Tenpenny. We're going to come back and talk about this more, but I want to say to the people on the left, the ones who are most strident in calling for the elimination of informed consent, understand that this was Ronald Reagan who created this kangaroo court, this vaccination court. The same time he was creating mandatory minimums that filled up our prisons to the bursting point.
Everything we said came true. Everything we've done's been right.
Her website is tenpennyimc.com. And we were just talking in the last segment about the history of the government's protection of the vaccine companies, going back to 1986, where Ronald Reagan removed the ability of people who suffer adverse effects from the drug companies' vaccines, removed their ability to sue the vaccine companies. Instead, they set up this kangaroo court with special masters who would allocate money based on people who have been injured on vaccines. You wouldn't have a real court, just like we don't have real courts for virtually anything anymore. Go ahead, Dr. Tenpenny. We were just talking about the vaccine court, and continue on with that and what they've done since then in terms of laws they put in that would force us to take vaccines.
Well, as if the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program in 1986 wasn't bad enough, it was in about 2004 that they passed something called Addendum E. And that's posted on my vaccine website, which is drtenpenny.com. And there is a downloadable PDF file that will be up there later today or in the next couple of days that I will share with all of the InfoWars listeners. And I wrote about it a lot in my book called Foul, Bird Flu, It's Not What You Think. And what Addendum E was the next level ramping up of complete protection for the pharmaceutical industry, that unless you could prove intent, that they were intending to create a product, either a vaccine or a drug, to kill you, and you died from this product, you had even less ability to have any sort of recourse than what the National Injury Compensation Program gave you. It was putting into place the fast tracking of vaccines and drugs if we needed them for a terrorism or a bioterrorism sort of activity. There was no compensation whatsoever. And the person who pushed that through was then Senator Fritz from Tennessee, who, again, was another Republican. And he wanted to push this through and gave complete protection to the pharmaceutical industry. It was tacked on at the end of a defense appropriation bill at the end of the session, when most of the people who were on the committee had already gone home for Christmas break. And they swore that they were going to revisit this after they returned from the Christmas break, which they never did. And so that is already on the books to protect them from all liability going forward. The other thing that is now coming into play is all the laws that are being pushed forward in a very rapid, illogical fashion to revoke all of the exemptions that we have had in place since the early 1900s for the right to refuse vaccines. All 50 states have had a medical exemption. 48 states have had a religious exemption, with the exception of West Virginia and Mississippi. And we've had 20 states that have had what's called a philosophical exemption, which means you look at the risk of the vaccine and you compare it to the risk of the illness and say, I don't think so. I think I can keep my children healthy by other means. Well, since this whole measles nonsense has rolled forward, they are now fast tracking these bills all across the country. In fact, if you go to the nvicadvocacy.org website, which tracks all of these bills that are coming forward, you will see that there are anywhere between 3 and 5 bills in every state to repeal all rights to refuse. In fact, right before I came on the show today, I got an email that Washington State, which historically has had a philosophical exemption, and a couple of years ago they limited that and said that you have to, in order to get your philosophical exemption, you have to have an appointment with a doctor and go through an indoctrination episode. And now they have passed a law, passed a committee that's gone into full law to completely repeal all rights to refuse in the state of Washington. And this just happened just in the last 48 hours.
And that's really a sad thing because, well, we do have one piece of good news, and I'll pass this on to you. We've been contacted by Representative David Satcher in Maine. He has sponsored a Maine House bill called My Body, My Choice. It's an act to make it illegal to require anyone to receive a vaccine against their free will. That is, though, the minority report. As you pointed out, in virtually all these states, we have a lot of bills that are being prepared to take away our exemption, as they call it. This is the way that they talk when they talk about, tax exemption, or they talk about a tax cut being an expenditure. In other words, all your money belongs to them unless they exempt it from being taken away. And then, of course, that's an expenditure. We are not allowed to have, as they're talking about in California, they say we want to eliminate the personal belief exemption. Of course, it's being pushed very heavily by the LA Times. Personal belief, that's what we used to call information, being informed. And then an exemption is what we used to say was consent. But now they have completely twisted this around. I think it's also interesting, Dr. Tenpenny, as you pointed out, the connections between Ronald Reagan, who put in the protection from being sued in 1986, and then the representative who pushed in this 2004 addendum to remove even more liability from the pharmaceutical companies, also being a Republican. I think it's very interesting when we look at how Megyn Kelly of Fox News comes in and says, well, yeah, it's Big Brother, but sometimes you need Big Brother. You know when you need Big Brother? It's when the guy who owns your network, Rupert Murdoch, has a son who's been sitting on the board for a number of years on GlaxoSmithKline. When you're intimately tied into the pharmaceutical industry, when they pay for most of the commercials that you put on your network, that's when you have to have Big Brother, when you got to force people to buy products from your corporate sponsors. And I find we're in a very dangerous situation right here because we know that the GOP is very closely linked to the pharmaceutical company and industry, and we know that the Democrats love the idea of mandates, and so they're pushing for this everywhere. This is a very concerning time, Dr. Tenpenny. I think they've got a really good chance of putting this through unless we get some kind of a coalition that goes across these political lines that breaks this kind of mindset that we need to mandate things and breaks this connection of crony capitalism that's rampant in the Republican Party.
Back in 2010, there was a policy that came out. It was called the Healthy People 2020 policy. And they've been doing this every 10 years to push forth public health agendas. And it started in the 80s, and every 10 years they evaluated where they had moved this public health agenda moving forward. And in 2010, there was this big celebratory thing that happened because the next 10 years between 2010 and 2020 was going to be the year to push forward all of these vaccine mandates, to disallow people the right to refuse, to make as an obligation of employment in the healthcare industry, not only nurses and doctors, but anybody else that works in healthcare, including people in the IT department and volunteers, in order to have not only a flu shot, but all of the vaccines that have been approved by the ACIP, the approval committee, that they should have all of these vaccines and be up to date on all of them as a requirement for employment. That was part of these Healthy People 2020 rules. So what we're seeing now in terms of taking away the exemptions, pushing the flu shots on healthcare workers, the next phase will be the additional shots like the pneumonia shot and all of those things. There's another policy statement that just came out on the 15th of February, which is an entire vaccine agenda pushing towards adolescents and adults, somewhere between 20 and 30 more vaccines in that schedule. And this is where we're going. If people don't understand that the right to refuse is not about the measles shot, it's not about whether you're a bad parent, whether or not you get your kids a couple of these vaccines. It's about what is barreling down the track at us in a very near future. And I would maintain that many of the very leftist or very liberal pro-vaccine, rabid pro-vaccine people that don't even understand that what is coming down on them, they may not want to have a shot that requires them to get get something for obesity or depression or for periodontal disease or for their high blood pressure. And they may not have a right to refuse that.
Yeah, we have a full-scale medical tyranny. As you pointed out, this is a plan they had in place, talking about how they're going to roll this out between 2010 and 2020. Here we are at the midpoint, and they're putting all the legislation in place. This is something I just don't understand. I know there's a knee-jerk reaction amongst many on the left to give all power to the state, to force people to do stuff. But as you point out, can't they see where this is headed in a full-scale medical tyranny? I just don't understand their mindset.
And not only will it become about vaccines, I mean, when they first started mandating flu shots for healthcare workers about 3 years ago, I had seen this coming for 5 or 6 years before that. And I said, where is this going to stop? That they require someone to be injected with a substance against their will that's not like a B12 shot or a vitamin shot. It's something that can cause them serious harm, in some cases even cause them to die. And the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program in the last 2 years has paid out more compensation for people injured by the flu shot than for any other vaccine. And I think it's because they're requiring so many people to have it. So where are we going to stop with that? Is it going to be all the vaccines? Is it going to be if you're having a bad day, you're required to have your Prozac? If your cholesterol level normal is less than 200 and yours is 201, you must take your Lipitor, you will be denied health insurance. Yeah. Are we going to be required to have these things to get on an airplane, to renew our driver's license, to go into a liquor store to prove that we can be out in public? I mean, where is this tyranny going to stop?
Full-scale control. You won't be able to travel. You won't be able to work. We've already seen this happen to the medical community. We've seen have many people who call in. We ask people to call in and tell us about the adverse reactions that they've had to vaccines. And, of course, we're going to be taking calls on that and on anything else you'd like to call in the next hour. I'll be giving that number out later on. But people will call in and say, I had to take this because I was in the military. I had to take it because I was a healthcare worker. They're going to extend that to everybody. They're not going to, as you pointed out, they're not going to let you travel. They're not going to let your kids get into school. They're going to essentially quarantine you out of society with this kind of medical tyranny. And, of course, they're not going to stop there. They will kick the door down at some point and come in and shoot you with a vaccine if you don't shoot them with a gun first. That's where it's really going to come down to. So we really need to fight this at this point. We need to wake up to what is the logical result of this. And Dr. Tenpenny, I think that we look at this and we say, look at the precedents that they're establishing, the way that they are setting the public up with their mindset, just talking about this measles thing, and we know that's just a small part of it. That's not really the full agenda. They're just using that right now. We've been talking about fluoridating the water for a long time. Whether you believe what we're saying about our health concerns about that or not, how do you ever justify mass medicating the public through the water supply for anything? You can't control the dosage when you put it into the water supply. We have legitimate dosages for anything. So you have a child who is maybe, you don't know what kind of level that they're going to get because you can't control the concentration of that when you just dump it into the water supply. They might get something that is many times higher than you would give to an adult male. So that's what we're concerned about. If you establish that as a principle, and that's what this is all about. That's what this measles epidemic is about, that they're talking about forcing people to take vaccines. They establish these precedents of mass medication, of taking away your informed consent. And they've got some things down the line that we should all be very concerned about, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, left or right.
Oh, absolutely. And not only do they have all the fluoride in the water, but there have been several studies that have come out now showing all of the pharmaceuticals that are in the water.
Yes.
And to my knowledge, there's no real filters out there to be able to filter out all these different pharmaceuticals because some of them are really small molecules. Some of them are very large molecules. And so we're getting our dose of daily Prozac in our tap water every day.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that with the fish. They talk about how the fish are behaving strangely and reacting to these SSRI drugs because, as you pointed out, the water systems are not filtering that out. The water treatment systems are not set up to filter those pharmaceuticals out, so they're accumulating and building in the water supply.
And even with children with vaccines, with this one-size-fits-all vaccination policy that is only set up for the convenience of doctor visits and the insurance company, that they are to get these vaccines at birth, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 1 year, and pre-kindergarten. It's all set up on that schedule at the convenience of the insurance industry. And all the vaccines are given at the same dose at the same way. So it doesn't matter if you are a 6-pound premature baby or if you're a 12-pound baby, you get the same dose. And the same thing happens all the way up the scale. There's another thing that not very many people know about is about half of the vaccines when you get the little vial and there's the gray stopper at the top that you put the needle through, in about half of the vaccines, that is a very inert rubber. It's a gray rubber that's very inert, causes no side effects, no reactions. In another half of the vaccines, those rubber stoppers still contain large amounts of latex. So they sensitize people to latex through that rubber stopper. And because you don't know which one of those that you're getting unless you know the manufacturer, you may be getting a lot of sensitization to latex, which increases your incidence of asthma and allergies, increases your reaction to foods. And all of these things are happening behind the scenes to confuse people so that they're not getting all of the same vaccine. Because if we were all getting all the same vaccine and it was dose related to our age and to our weight, and we're taking into consideration things like family history and whether your parents had a vaccine reaction, we would have a completely different conversation. But instead, it's this militant tyranny to make sure we were all inoculated with all of these substances.